Psychologists.
My talk today is on the cultural and the biological shaping of religion's effects. And in my research, I've studied a number of different topics, but really the main focus of my work is religion. And as a psychologist, I find this topic particularly interesting for a number of reasons. So first, it might just be one of the oldest forms of human social interaction. So there have been recent archaeological discoveries here in the Fertile Crescent, for instance, suggesting that organized religion might have started about 11,000 years ago. So that's before the start of early agriculture, before the formation of large groups, long time. And really basic religious beliefs and practices, they go back much further than that, with the earliest evidence being the use of spiritual symbols in burial rituals. That actually dates back to 75,000 years ago. So religion has been around for a very long time, but it's also an interesting phenomenon because you can find some form of it across all human cultures throughout the world. And even today, it's quite prevalent worldwide. So a recent Gallup poll asked people around the world, is religion an important part of your daily life? So you can ask that to yourself, is it important to my daily life? And people can respond either yes or no. Now, the median proportion of people across countries who said yes to this question is 82%. So this is a map showing level of religiousness around the world in relation to that median of 82%, saying religion is important in my daily life. So basically, the darker the green, the more religious the country. You can see that Canada and the US actually fall below the median because only 65% in the US will say yes to this question and 45% in Canada. So religion is very old, and much of the world is still religious, and yet religion as a topic in psychology was not very well understood for a long time. So in fact, as recently as the early 2000s, famous psychologists like Roy Baumeister, for instance, have explicitly noted this lack of basic understandings about this topic. So Baumeister, he writes that like television, money, sex, aggression, religion is an important fact of life, and psychology cannot pretend to be complete unless it understands religion alongside these other phenomena. But what is religion? So even defining religion is, of course, no easy task. Researchers completely disagree on what does or does not constitute religion, but I think there are some key components that do tend to come up across definitions, spanning from William James to more contemporary researchers in psychology. So religion typically involves ritualized practices and beliefs. And it also requires certain commitments that can take devout participants quite a lot of time to engage in. Religion is shared with other people in a community, and a really critical point is that it's centered around mental representations of the divine, so notions of God, spirits, and other supernatural beings. So this is just a general working definition that some researchers will use, and although religion is still not very well understood considering its scope, I think recently it has become more of this hot topic in mainstream psychological research. So a lot of research has been done recently on religious coping, for instance, and it finds that people tend to use religion more when times are tough. And that can help them gain a sense of control in their lives and also a sense of community. Research also shows that religious people tend to give more to charity than secular people do. Religious people are known for being more politically conservative and also for being more prejudiced towards outgroups. Now, for some of these effects, you may look at it and say, well, that's completely obvious, right? But others, you might be more likely to question. So, does religion necessarily make people more conservative? Does religion always encourage people to act pro-socially? So what I'd like to argue is that for questions like these, the answer, as often is the case in science, is it depends. So I think a lot of the things we think we know about religion's impacts in reality might only be true for certain people within particular contexts. So what I'm really interested in understanding is this. What are the important moderators of religion's effects? In other words, how does religion affect people in different ways depending on characteristics of the individual and other aspects of the social or the cultural context? So to get at this question, my research has focused on two broad perspectives, a sociocultural perspective and a biological perspective. And in my talk today, I'll show how I've used one or a combination of these perspectives to look at a couple of different topics. So first, I've used a cultural psychological perspective to examine how religious values and the way religion helps people to cope may differ by culture. Next, I've used a biological perspective. Oops, sorry about that. I've used a biological perspective to look at how religion's impact on pro-social behavior might depend on biological predispositions. And then finally, I've integrated both the sociocultural and a biological perspective to re-examine the way that religion is used to cope. But to start off, I'll be discussing my research first on religious values and coping from a cultural psychological perspective. Okay, so to begin this part of my talk, I'd like you first to take a look at these two images. So does anyone know what these images might be? What this? Yes, the La Pietà is the one on the right. So the one on the left is actually also Mary and Jesus. Okay. So the one on the left is the one that people in North American context typically see as less familiar, but that's called a teko teko on the left. That's a carving done by the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. And the one on the right, I think most people were able to more easily recognize, so Michelangelo's La Pietà. So I really like these images because I think they really nicely illustrate the way I've been thinking about religion and culture in my research. So these works of art, they're based on the same Christian faith, and they're founded on the same religious texts, but religion might not be experienced in the same way for people from these different cultures. So around the world, one of the main ways people experience religion is as a means to cope with difficulties. And much of the research on religious coping so far has been done in the context of North America. So now from this research, it seems that one way that religion may help people to cope is by encouraging social affiliation, or spending time and interacting with others. So in religious groups, fellowship with other people in a community, getting involved in different social gatherings, these are particularly important. So in this way, religion can give people a social network to help them cope with the stressors in their lives. Now, another way religion might help people is by increasing a sense of control in difficult times. So in particular, research suggests that religion emphasizes mostly what's called secondary control, or accepting and adjusting yourself to the situation, rather than primary control, which is influencing or changing the situation. And this emphasis on secondary control might happen because religion usually encourages humility on the part of its practitioners and requires adjusting the self to some external higher power. But the way religion impacts people's thoughts and their behaviors might not be the same everywhere, because religion often exists within this larger sociocultural context. So what that means is that culture, as this organized system of beliefs, values, and practices, can act as a frame through which even the same religion is understood. So as an example, qualitative work has shown that American values, independence, personal choice, these have influenced the way that Christianity is practiced in the United States today. So although religion might universally help people to cope, specifically how people are using religion might be bound by culture. Perspectives from cultural psychology, I think, can be really useful for predicting how religious coping might vary systematically for people from different cultures. So people from more individualistic cultures, such as in North America, for instance, tend to have a more independent sense of self. So that means they see themselves as more separate from others. They emphasize individual freedom, personal agency. So for them, secondary control may be a particularly important role of religion. Now, the reasoning behind this is that secondary control, or acceptance and adjustment of the self to the situation, this ultimately focuses on the individual. So it should be more of a concern for people who are more independent. Now, people from more collectivistic cultures, such as in East Asia, for instance, they tend to be more interdependent. So that means they're more connected to close others. They emphasize harmony with other people, maintaining their very close relationships. So for them, social affiliation should be a particularly relevant use of religion because it centers around social relationships more than the individual. So in this first line of research, I've conducted 3 studies to look at how the use of religion might vary in these ways systematically depending on the cultural context. So first, I wanted to see how religion might shape religious values at this more collective level through cultural products or practices. So I looked at church websites and conducted a content analysis of their mission statements. So if you've seen any church websites before, you probably know that many of them will have what's called a mission statement that says something about their core values, who they are as a church, etc. So in this study, I simply asked the question, how do themes in these online church mission statements differ by culture? And this study used the United States and Korea as cultural comparison groups, since the US tends to be relatively more individualistic, and Korea tends to be relatively more collectivistic. And we focused on Christianity because this is prevalent in both countries. So I hypothesized that more US websites should have these themes of secondary control or acceptance compared to Korean websites. And that more Korean websites should have these themes of social affiliation compared to US websites. So I had 2 US coders judge 100 US church websites. And I had 2 Korean coders judge 100 Korean church websites for a total of 200 mission statements. So the main coding in this study was binary, which means the coders determined whether or not a mission statement contained any characteristics relevant first to secondary control. So for example, emphasizing spiritual maturity or growth through bettering the self, and social affiliation, such as emphasizing close relationships within the church or with other believers. So I'll give you an example. So here's an example from the mission statement that had a secondary controls theme. It says, we strive to be a Christian congregation dedicated to a strong tradition of worship, committed to spiritual inquiry and growth. And here's one that had a social affiliation theme. We're called to be a caring family of Christians, living out our faith together, building a contagious Christian community. Okay. And the mission statements here could be categorized as one theme or both or none, so the coding was not forced choice. All right, so when I looked at these themes that are displayed in mission statements, the results showed that significantly more mission statements in the US contain secondary control-related themes compared to those in Korea. This is consistent with hypotheses. And significantly more mission statements in Korea contain these themes of social affiliation compared to those in the US. And just anecdotally, another interesting thing I noticed in these websites is some of the websites in Korea even had kind of social interactive features, like you could sign in. It was Facebook-like, some of them. So this is something we didn't look at in this study, but just a little side note. So regardless of culture, a key purpose of these church mission statements is to publicly express and then reinforce the values and the practices of the congregation, to bring people to the church by telling them what they believe, what they do, right? But what my findings suggest is that the content of their religious beliefs or their values might differ in these meaningful ways depending on the larger cultural context. So in the next study, I moved from this collective to a more individual level of analysis to see whether religion causally impacts secondary control for people in this laboratory setting and whether this effect is moderated by culture. So this study has a 2-by-2 between subjects design. So we had European American and Asian American participants who were all religious, so they were pre-selected from pre-screening to identify as religious, and in this sample, they're mostly Christian. And I manipulate religion explicitly. So I use an explicit religion prime. So participants were either given the option of writing about religious values or not. And we know it's relevant to them because we pre-selected them to be religious. The dependent variable in the study is secondary control or acceptance. And I was really interested in trying to measure this behaviorally by observing what participants do or how they react to a mildly distressing situation that we created for them in the lab. And the reasoning behind this is that basically if participants are experiencing an increase in secondary control, so they're trying to accept the situation more, then they should basically have less of a need to influence their situation, and they should express less discontent in a distressing situation that we create for them in the lab. Okay? So in this study, we predicted that European Americans should experience more secondary control or express less discontent when they're primed with religion compared to when they're not primed with religion. However, I predicted that this effect should basically not hold for Asian participants, so there should be no difference between the priming conditions for them. Okay, so I'll go over briefly what we did in this study. So here, first participants come in, they complete a prime in which they're either given the option to write about religious values or not. Next, they're shown 4 sample prizes. So these are the actual prizes, and they're told, you can get your first choice prize if you do really well on this main task that's coming up in the study. Okay? So they carefully look at these amazing prizes, and then they rank them from most to least desired. So you can see Ty here, he really wants that folder. That's the one he wants the most. Okay? After that, they're given the main task. But with rigged feedback. So basically, everybody thought that they did really well and they would be getting their first choice prize. Okay? But then at this point, the experimenter tells the participants, you know, I'm really sorry, but the lab is currently out of prizes. So could you just wait here for just a minute? I'm going to have another research assistant run to a different lab, and they're going to get the prize that you want. Is that okay? So they say, sure, that's fine. You know, they wait. And after a few minutes, the experimenter comes back and they return, not with the participant's first choice, but with their last choice prize. So the dreaded memo in this case. Okay. So some were pretty disappointed, like this participant, you can see. But maybe they didn't say anything about it being the wrong prize. In that case, they just continue on in the study, they fill out the questionnaires. But other participants, when they get the wrong prize, they're very quick to tell the experimenter, you know, this is actually not the prize that I wanted. Okay? So the experimenters in this study who were unaware of the condition, they're unaware of hypothesis, they recorded what participants did in this situation. So first, did the participants ask for the correct prize? Or did they not? Second, did they show any nonverbal cues of discontent, such as staring at the prize for a long time? And last, how bothered overall did they seem by this mistake? Or what was their level of negative affect, as we would say, okay? So I'll report the results for these 3 judgments for you separately, so you can see what happened. Okay, so first, did they say anything? I looked at whether or not participants said anything to the experimenter about the wrong prize, and a log linear test for this showed that, consistent with the hypothesis, there's a significant 3-way interaction in the log linear of culture, prime, and verbal complaints. So what this means is that for European Americans, the bars on the left, there's a significant difference in whether or not they made verbal complaints, depending on the prime. So when they're not primed with religion, that's this red bar here, 18% of participants asked for the correct prize. And there's no missing bar, there's just 0 there, that's the bar. 0 participants actually asked for the correct prize when they're primed with religion. Okay. Now for Asians, interestingly, the same difference did not occur. So this difference between the bars is statistically not significant, but if anything, you can see the pattern is actually in the opposite direction from the European Americans. Okay, next, so for participants who did not ask for the correct prize, which was actually most of them, most of them don't say anything, we looked at their use of nonverbal cues to communicate that they're upset to the experimenter. And here I found again a similar interaction. Okay. So here, significantly fewer European Americans made nonverbal cues that they were upset when they were primed with religion compared to when they were not primed with religion. But there's not a significant difference, again, in the nonverbal cues between Asians who were primed with religion versus not. Okay. And last, we looked at how bothered they were, so how much negative affect they were showing overall, and it's a similar pattern. So basically for European Americans, when they're primed with religion, they show significantly less negative affect than when they're not primed with religion. For Asian Americans, the same difference doesn't happen. When they're primed with religion, there was no difference in how bothered they seem to be compared to when they're not primed with religion. Okay. Okay, so next, so in the last study, in the third study, I wanted to show how religion might impact people not just in the lab, but in their everyday lives. So here, I use daily diary methods to examine the question, how do people from different cultures use religion in their daily lives to cope with naturally occurring stressors. So instead of creating something for them in the lab that's very stressful, like not getting the folder, we wanted to see what was actually happening in their daily lives. So participants are talking about whatever is specific to them. Okay. And particularly, I was interested in looking at how religious coping might be associated with the use of secondary control and social relationships as they cope with their daily stressors in the US and in Korea. So in this study, I predicted that religious coping should predict more secondary control or acceptance of the situation for European Americans more than Koreans. And I also predicted that religious coping should predict more social coping for Koreans more than European Americans. So in this study, our participants complete an online questionnaire that they can complete at home at the end of every day for 7 consecutive days. So in these questionnaires, participants are asked, what was your biggest stressor of the day? Okay, so it says, describe your most important stressful event of the day, and they can write it out. And then they completed items about how they coped with that stressor. So specifically, measures included religious coping. So an example item for religious coping is, I sought help from God or a higher power. There's secondary control. So an example item of this is, I accepted the reality of the situation. And also, we're interested in social coping. So an example for this is, I talked to somebody about the situation. Okay, so for this study, using hierarchical linear modeling, I first looked at the relationship between religious coping and secondary control. So here you can see there's a significant interaction between culture and religious coping on the use of secondary control. So for Koreans, this red line, there's no association. But for European Americans, that's this yellow line, there's a significant positive association. So basically, the more they use religious coping to deal with their stressor, the more they also used secondary coping, or acceptance of the situation, both on a given day and across the 7 days. And this is consistent with what we predicted. Now, for the results on social coping, you can see here that there is not a significant interaction between culture and religious coping. So here, this is not what we expected for both groups. The more they used religious coping, the more they also used social coping on a day and across days, and the difference between the slopes actually wasn't significant. So if you look at the simple slopes of the lines for Koreans and European Americans, it showed that the association seems stronger for Koreans, that's the red line, than European Americans, but again, the difference between slopes is not significant. Okay, so to briefly sum up this first set of studies on religion and culture, Religion might impact secondary control for people from more individualistic cultures, allowing them to accept the situation and adjust the self more. But this might not necessarily be the case as much for people from more collectivistic cultures. And we know this because first, the mission statements on church websites strongly emphasized these values that were relevant to secondary control in the US more than Korea. Second, European Americans show more secondary control behaviors when they're primed with religion in the lab. And last, European Americans seem to rely on secondary control when they're using religion to cope in their everyday lives. But on the other hand, religion may be linked to social affiliation everywhere, but maybe particularly so for those from more collectivistic cultures who tend to strongly emphasize maintaining close relationships. And we know this because people in both cultures rely on social relationships when they're using religion to cope in their everyday lives. Though in collectivistic cultures, it's possible that religious communities might be valuing social affiliation even more than individualistic cultures, as evidenced by the cultural differences we saw in the church mission statements. So far, I've shown that using a cultural psychological perspective can help clarify how thoughts and behaviors might vary systematically across groups of people. But that's not to say that the effect of culture is limitless, right? So that's not what I'm trying to say. Any effects of culture are constrained by what's given to us by nature or our genes, because genes are what provide us with a range of possible traits. But at the same time, the effects of our biological makeup are shaped by the environment we live in, because genes are what provide us with that range of possible traits. Okay? So for any particular trait or behavior, there are influences from both nature and nurture, and I think on top of that, biological and cultural influences often work together or they interact to lead to particular outcomes. So in the next part of my talk, I'll be discussing some of my research on how religion affects behavioral outcomes that are using a biological perspective and also integrating a biological and a cultural perspective. So in genetics research, the gene-environment interaction framework is a really important one for us to understand because it's commonly used to understand, to look at the joint effects of genes and the environment. So beyond the individual contributions of genes and the environment, this framework rests on the idea that most traits and behaviors are affected to some degree by the interaction of the two. So having the same genetic predisposition may actually lead to different outcomes depending on the environment. So for example, Caspi and colleagues have shown that stress in the environment might lead to depression for some people, but not others, because of genetic differences in their susceptibility to stress. And here, this is indicated by the serotonin transporter polymorphism, so your genes. And similarly, the relationship between genetic variation and depression here depends on stress in the environment, okay? So it's about the interaction. And it's worth noting that there's been some debate here in the form of meta-analyses about the replicability of gene-environment interaction effects. But the larger and more recent meta-analyses seem to find evidence in favor of Caspi's initial finding, which is that genes moderate the effects of stress on depression. So in this next line of research, I use this gene-environment interaction perspective to examine questions relevant to religion. More specifically, how might religion's influence on thoughts and behaviors be conceptualized as environmental influence that interacts with genes to lead to different outcomes? So in this next study, the particular outcome I was interested in was prosocial behavior, because there's been quite a bit of research on this very recently. And yet, if you ask the question, does religion encourage prosocial behavior? I think the answer is not yet exactly straightforward. So across all major religions, there's at least this explicit emphasis on prosociality, or the idea that you should do things that benefit others at a cost to the self. But the findings on whether or not that plays out in terms of actual behavior are less clear. So people who are more religious, they tend to report behaving more prosocially compared to the non-religious people. That's pretty consistent. But the behavioral evidence sometimes is consistent with the self-report, and other times shows absolutely no difference between people who are religious versus non-religious in their actual behaviors. However, there's more recent research suggesting that maybe priming or reminding people about religion might generally increase prosocial behavior. So to the extent that people think God is watching them, maybe they feel pressured at some level to behave prosocially, okay? So in order to try to address some of these inconsistencies, I've used the framework of gene-environment interactions to see whether religion might be increasing prosociality more for certain people depending on genetic predispositions. So since I'm looking at prosocial behavior as an outcome here, a good candidate gene for this topic is the dopamine receptor gene called DRD4, because it has a polymorphism or genetic variant that's associated with antisocial or prosocial behavior. In particular, genetics researchers have shown that people with certain variants of DRD4 tend to be more antisocial, showing more risk-taking, sensation, novelty-seeking. DRD4 is also associated with reward-seeking, and people with DRD4 variants that are associated with this risk-taking, sensation-seeking, they also show decreased altruism or donate less compared to people with other variants of DRD4. But a really important caveat here is that the so-called risky variants of DRD4 might only be risky under certain conditions. So what researchers have now argued is that certain DRD4 variants may actually be more environmentally sensitive. So in one environment, they may look risky or antisocial, but in another environment, the opposite might be true. So there are a few studies now that have tested this hypothesis of environmental sensitivity, but I'll explain one study in particular that I think makes it particularly clear. So in this study, researchers included children who either had this environmentally sensitive variant of DRD4 or they did not have that, okay? And when you look at donating behavior between just these two groups of children, it turns out that the ones with the environmentally sensitive or the risky variant of DRD4 are less likely to donate than children without the DRD4 variant that's associated with environmental sensitivity, okay? So this suggests that maybe DRD4 might directly predict prosocial behavior if you look just at these results. But the really interesting thing here is that children with the environmentally sensitive variant, the ones on the left, they're actually more likely to donate if they have secure attachments, if they experience really responsive parenting. And on the other hand, children without this environmentally sensitive variant of DRD4 on the right, they didn't donate any more or less depending on attachment or parenting. So this is another interesting instance of gene-environment interaction because it shows that people with certain genetic tendencies might behave very differently depending on pressures from the environment. So to the extent that religion might act as this environmental pressure to behave prosocially, it's possible that religion increases prosociality for people who are more predisposed to be environmentally sensitive than not. So before I go over the specific predictions for my study, I can really briefly explain how DRD4 allele variants relate to environmental sensitivity. So the gene DRD4 has alleles that range from 2 to 11 repeats, but the relationship between the allele length and the function is nonlinear. So it's not really the case that having more repeats is associated with more of anything else psychologically. So in general, the 2 and the 7 repeat alleles are known to have similar functions biologically. And so people with the 2 or the 7 repeat variants tend to be more environmentally sensitive, and people with other variants tend to be less environmentally sensitive in general. So for this study, I predicted that people with the 2 or the 7 repeat variants should show the greatest effect of religion on prosocial behavior. And then people with other variants should show the smallest effect of religion on prosocial behavior. So there were 109 European Americans and 69 Asian or Asian Americans who participated in this study for a total of 178. And since religious values emphasize the value, religious teachings, they emphasize the value of prosociality in the same way across cultures, we did not expect, nor did we find that culture moderates the effects of genes on prosocial behavior in the study. So in this study, what we did is first, we manipulate whether or not participants are thinking about religion, this time without their awareness, using what's called a sentence scramble task. So in the religion condition, participants are given some words in the sentence scramble that are related to religion. So for example, God, spirit, divine, prophet, sacred. And in the neutral condition, participants are not given any religion relevant words. Okay? And then in order to tap into prosocial behavior towards society in general, rather than a specific person or a specific group, I measured participants' willingness to basically donate their time by supporting these environmental causes that are relevant to the university. So here participants are shown our UCSB sustainability website. And then they're instructed to read these very brief descriptions of pro-environmental organizations and clubs on campus. Then for each of these 36 different actual organizations, so for instance, the Green Campus Program, they're just to check whether or not they want to receive more information about the organization, if they want to be added to their mailing list, or if they want to get involved in projects. Okay, and then the checklist from these 36 different organizations is combined to make a composite. And then last in the study, participants are giving us saliva samples for the DNA analysis. Okay, so what I found here is that if you look first at the neutral or the control condition, those with the 2 or the 7 allele, the 2 or the 7 repeat allele, the environmentally sensitive types, they were actually less prosocial than those without the 2 or the 7. So this is consistent with past research on DRD4 and prosocial behavior, showing that people with the 2 or the 7 repeat allele, they may be more antisocial. Okay. But the religion prime actually had very different effects for people with these different genetic variants. So if you look at those first, without the 2 or the 7 repeats, the bars on the right, they're supposed to be not as environmentally sensitive. You can see the prime doesn't seem to make a difference for their prosocial behavior. But for people with the 2 or the 7 repeat who are genetically predisposed to be sensitive to the environment, the religion primes seem to significantly increase their prosocial behavior. Okay? So when people who are supposedly more environmentally sensitive are thinking about religion without their awareness, they're more compelled to volunteer for these organizations compared to when they're not thinking about religion. So here we replicated past research on the effect of implicit religious priming on prosocial behavior because there is here a main effect of religion on the DV. But as you can see, this main effect is completely driven by the people with the environmentally sensitive variants. And I think it's also really interesting to note that of these 4 groups, of the 4 bars, people with the 2 or the 7 repeat alleles on the left, they're the ones who volunteer the most when they're given an environmental pressure to do so. But they volunteered the least when there was none. So what these results suggest is that religion might be a form of environmental pressure, leading people to behave prosocially, and that this matters more for people who are genetically predisposed to be sensitive to environmental inputs than people who are not. So I think an interesting question that comes to this research, from this research is, how specific is this DRD4 by religion interaction to pro-social behavior? Okay, so should this link between should the link between religion and any psychological outcome be intensified for people who are more environmentally sensitive if they have that variant of DRD4? So in the same data set, we recently tried to examine this question and found that this basically doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, so in this study, I re-examined coping as an outcome by giving participants a prize that they didn't want, just as in the previous prize study I described. Only this time we secretly videotaped participants. So we could see what they were doing while the experimenter was in the room with them, interacting with them, and also after the experimenter left and they were alone. So I'm gonna show you a video that wasn't working earlier, but let's see if this works. Yeah, the sound's not working. Okay. So just take it out.
Yeah. Well, can I help? Where are the speakers? Right here? Yeah, so when you finish, just press down on this button.
Okay.
And then the light will go off.
So is it on?
Yeah.
So now we need you to fill out some questionnaires. Fill in your prize name and just rate the item according to the scales provided. And just come let me know when you're done.
God, it's the best folder ever. It's super useful.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see, in the first study, we unfortunately didn't have access to what participants were doing when we left, but it was really interesting for us to go through these videos for this study because a lot of them did really interesting things after we closed the door. So as I discussed earlier in this talk, some of that other research showed that religion can make European Americans accept this situation more, so show less negative affect, and that was when they're interacting with the experimenter. But in this study, we don't find that this effect of the religion prime on negative affect is any different for European Americans who have different variants of DRD4. So it doesn't seem to be the case that people with the environmentally sensitive variant of DRD4 just react more strongly to the religion prime just across the board, okay? However, what's interesting is that when you look at a gene that is more relevant or specific to negative affect as a psychological outcome, then a gene by environment interaction emerges. So here, we looked at the oxytocin receptor gene, or OXTR, which is linked to socio-emotional sensitivity. And we found that there's a gene by environment interaction when participants are interacting face-to-face with the experimenter in a more social context. So what we see is that among people who have a GG genotype, in this case, these are people who are supposed to be more socially oriented, they seem less bothered or show less negative affect in this distressing situation when they're primed with religion compared to when they're not primed with religion. However, for people with the AG or AA genotypes who are supposedly less socially oriented, the prime did not impact how bothered they seemed when they interacted with our experimenters. It's also important to note here that there's no gene by environment interaction when participants are alone in the room. So we remove them from a social context and they're just interacting alone in the room, and we don't see the gene by environment interaction. So I think it's really important to look at these results together with the findings on prosociality because it shows that it doesn't seem to be the case that one gene interacts with any environment indiscriminately to affect any psychological outcome. Doesn't make much sense. So instead, it seems more likely that when people think about religion versus not, people with certain predispositions for reward, for instance, might be more impacted in a way that's relevant to reward. But people with other predispositions linked to socio-emotional sensitivity, for instance, they may be more influenced in a way that's relevant to expressing emotion in a social interaction. Okay. So from this gene-religion interaction study, you can see that it's possible religion might act as this external pressure for behaving pro-socially, only for people who are more sensitive to reward in the environment. I think these findings, the findings on pro-social behavior in particular, might have some really interesting implications for people who are interested in maybe morality more generally. For instance, I think it raises the somewhat controversial possibility that people with different genetic tendencies are acting pro-socially for these different reasons. So people who have the 2 or the 7 repeat allele, who are more environmentally sensitive to reward, they might act pro-socially because they feel pressured to do so. But people without the 2 or the 7 repeat, they actually experience greater dopamine or reward signaling as baseline. So the act itself to them might feel good. And this research, I think, also showed that religion might influence coping differently depending on genes, as well as the social context. Now, although all of this research on gene-environment interactions, and certainly gene-religion interactions, this is still very new, I believe that incorporating a socio-cultural and a biological approach holds a lot of promise, because I think it allows us to try to see how nature and nurture are not these opposing forces, a false dichotomy, but instead are constantly working together and interacting in order to affect psychological phenomena. And this work, I think, also contributes to the way that gene-environment research in general is done. And it bridges that research more with other areas of psychology and cognitive science, because this is one of the first to show that this experimentally manipulated prime might interact with the gene and lead to a specific psychological outcome. So now we know that gene-environment interaction research, that can be extended to include features of the situation that might fluctuate from moment to moment in our lives. So this is something that could have applications in the field more broadly. So to sum up, I think regardless of our personal religious beliefs or disbeliefs, psychology still has much to explain about religion's influence around the world. And on top of that, my research suggests that we should consider the social and the cultural context in which religion is practiced and the biological tendencies of individuals in order to better understand how religion might actually be impacting people's lives. So I'd like to thank all of my great collaborators, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, we take questions, and just a reminder to direct the questions to the content of the talk that we're giving.
Thank you. Well, hopefully I don't get in trouble based on what you just said, but I'd like to ask you perhaps to see if your research might apply to areas other than religion. I'm sorry, but I'm wondering about other types of communities, so at least in that related context, perhaps non-profit organizations, businesses, or any other kind of community that you can really think of to see if this type of behavior, do you think we could replicate it in other areas, or is there something specific to religion here?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think even for organizations or communities, businesses that don't have to do with religion, these are all, I see them all as embedded first in a larger sociocultural context. So I do think that that general idea can absolutely be applied outside of religion. I don't think that's specific to religion. And if you're asking specifically about maybe the prosociality bit, so yeah, there is evidence that aside from religious pressures, there are other completely secular pressures that people really, that it's effective for people for behaving prosocially. So the government, for instance, reminding people that the police are watching you, this kind of thing, that's been done in the lab, so it has been shown that if you remind people of those kinds of forces and checks on their behavior, that can also elicit more prosocial behavior. And I would think that if it's the case that people who are sensitive to reward really are attentive to those cues, and then they use that to then enact their behavior, it shouldn't matter if it's religion, or for them, if what's really meaningful is their community members or an organization or the police, whatever it is. And yeah, that should absolutely still have a similar interaction. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks.
Hi there. So
Hi.
that first study, the one involving the prizes, the first one involving the prizes.
Yeah.
So the American European participants
Yeah.
with the religious prime
Yes.
displayed more secondary control, whereas the Asian Americans didn't. But I thought it was interesting that it was flipped,
Yes,
the
that is
opposite way.
flipped. Yeah.
So, do you think that has something to do with? I'm wondering. I want to get your take on that. Do you think that has something to do with maybe a collectivist sense of fairness that was violated by the fact that they didn't get the right prize? What do you like? How does you know what I mean? What's your read on that result?
Yeah, so yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So I'm hesitant to overinterpret any of those because none of the patterns for the Asians were actually significant. In the first pattern I showed you, maybe that looks like more of a difference than maybe the other ones, but you're right. In general, it seems like the pattern is opposite. So, I mean, I haven't thought about that possibility that you raised. I think that's a really interesting one, but one way I've tried to think about it is perhaps in that context, because for East Asians, maybe religion even more so makes them affiliate more with others. It's possible that maybe when they feel more affiliated with the experimenter, then they are more likely to say something. But I'm not really sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the way that I've been thinking about it. Like, is this a social thing? Are they construing the situation a bit differently than the European Americans? But again, I haven't, I hesitate to, interpret it beyond that, probably.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah. Hi, Professor. So for people who grow up or are immersed in different religions and cultures in the same household, so one
Yes.
person being, a mother being Buddhist or a father being Christian, how does that affect them in terms of secondary control and self-affiliation? Do they get both of the benefits, or do they get none? What do you think on that?
Yeah, so the question of biculturalism or multiculturalism, I think, it's complicated because there are different ways that people can be bicultural or have multiple religious influences in their lives. So the way that they integrate the different values can be very different. So for some people, they do find more of an integration or a mix, a true mix. So maybe they would be more in the middle. For other people, they might switch. So in some contexts, they are more like this religion, in other contexts are more like that, and same thing for their culture. They could be more embedded in one culture or another, and they behave very similarly actually to people who are monocultural when they're in specific contexts. So I guess it depends on how they are bicultural, not just that they are bicultural, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my question was also about the experiment with the prizes.
Yeah.
So, for example, so the difference between two prizes here, it was like a folder and a pencil or something like that. But if the difference was bigger, for example, like a MacBook and a pencil, like you would probably ask for the other prize. Or on the other hand, like if it was between two different brands of juice, I probably wouldn't ask to get the other brand.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I feel like this preference might not necessarily be cultural. It might be more an individual type of preference.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how you isolated the specific variable that you were trying to examine.
Good, yeah. So I think that's a good question about the specific methods behind that. So we do pre-test the prizes beforehand. So we didn't have a lot of money, so we decided cheap prizes would be best. And then we went and we asked people how much they liked the different prizes, and we tried to make it so that they were about the same. Like, I like pencils and I like folders, but it's not like there wasn't a big difference. So on average, when we pre-tested, people liked all these items about the same, because I think your intuition is right that if we gave them like a MacBook or a pencil and then we tell them, sorry, I don't know, or we just give them the pencil and assume that nothing is wrong. That's something might be weird there, where basically we would get a ceiling effect where everybody asks for the MacBook, right? So we needed something where we could adequately look for variability in participants' responses according to our manipulation. So we don't want different prizes like that. We want them to be pretty similar. And also, well, you mentioned something about how, well, if it was just like this brand of orange juice or that brand of orange juice, who cares? There's a lot of psychological research to show that once you choose this brand of orange juice, like you want that brand. So people are upset, yeah. So, you know, as you could see in the video when she's filling out the prize questionnaire, she's like, this will be super useful. You know, she just, yeah, I mean, people don't like the prize they didn't get. So when we ask them afterwards and we look at those responses, it's pretty clear that they didn't like that prize compared to, we asked them earlier in the study how much they liked the prizes. It definitely dropped, like they don't like that prize. It's pretty clear. And then, let's see, you asked a follow-up, a last question. I don't know if
like how you just about how you isolated the variable you were checking. I think you answered the question.
I did. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I got all the questions you asked.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. So in the experiment with the video, you showed that's available the secondary acceptance, but it never showed like how well people are accepting. So is there any video of people who were just flat out laughing when they get the wrong prize, or they just act positively? They just feel that this is just some sort of a joke, and they just treat it positively.
Okay, so there are videos where they laugh in the way you're describing, but I wouldn't say it's a positive thing. So I don't know what it's called. It's kind of an angry laugh. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, they do sometimes laugh. But you know, when we measure their negative affect, basically, if people you know, when we coded the videos, appear truly positive, so not just that they're laughing, but it seems like they're fine, you know, then they would have very low scores on our negative affect rating. So we do account for that in our codings.
So nobody was amused during the test, right?
Again, not in the positive way, like they loved it and they just, like if they had basically if they were laughing like that because they absolutely knew what was going on, we detect that, we ask them about that later, and usually those kinds of participants we wouldn't include in the analysis because they're sufficiently suspicious about the whole setup. So, yeah, but I don't know if that's your question.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have to move this down a bit. So a little more. I can stand on my tiptoes. You mentioned a number of studies that involved comparing European or American people with Asians and Asian Americans. Did you or has anyone else sort of looked at the difference between Asians and Asian Americans?
Yes, so in our study, we don't have enough of those different groups to split them and look at them legitimately, so we look at them together, and if anything, it underestimates the effect by including Asian Americans. So some studies have focused just on Asian Americans who are born and raised in the United States, and East Asians who recently immigrated. There's lots of cultural research on that, and basically depending on the outcome, there are meaningful effects between those groups because Asian Americans are bicultural, so oftentimes at home they're raised in a different context and they have different values than in their mainstream culture. Yeah, so they have looked at that, yes. But I think it's related to kind of Michael's question earlier about the biculturals and how they're bicultural. So that's my short answer to it.
Thank you.
No, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
What kind of evolutionary implications could you draw from the graph showing the environmentally sensitive group being statistically different, that large statistical difference when they were primed religiously?
What kind of evolutionary implications can I draw from the DRD for environmentally sensitive types? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. So we know that this variant is linked to reward sensitivity. And it's possible that maybe in certain places where historically they have to be more reward sensitive, seek novel objects, take more risks, it's possible that that might be more prevalent in those areas than other places. So that's where maybe an evolutionary approach could come to bear, right? But in our study where we're looking at the interaction, I think it adds to that story because it's not just about it being prevalent or not. It's about that particular, that particular genotype being in interaction with a specific environment. So they could have, in one moment, one environment that produces more of a pro-social response, and in another environment, it looks like more of an antisocial response.
So do you think religion could be? Do you think it was a selective pressure, almost creative selective pressure for that variant?
So with religion?
Yeah.
Maybe could you expand on that? I'm not sure.
So when you use the religious prime, they become more pro-social, right?
Yes.
Do you think the institution of religion could be a selective pressure for that variant because when you have religion increasing the pro-social behavior, therefore increasing, where was I going with this?
Yeah, so I just want to make
you
sure
see
I
what I mean?
understood.
It's like could it be like a created selective pressure for that variant?
So, yeah, I'm really hesitant to say that I think that's possible. The reason is that, these variants, it's like a very, very, very long time ago that they evolved with those particular variants of the gene. So everybody has that gene, DRD4, is just different versions of it. So, I mean, even though religion goes back a long ways, those variants were in existence way, way, way before then. So it's more likely to me that those kinds of variants maybe evolved in concert with other pressures that maybe were very, very basic. And that later on, religion became something that it could be kind of in place of those kinds of general pressures. But that would be my...
I like that, actually.
I mean, that's what I think is the most likely explanation. But I don't know that people have gone into that yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. My question is similar to Jesse's and a couple of others who asked about multicultural subjects and studies, but particularly about the experiment you described first, where you examined Christian mission statements. Assuming correctly or not that Koreans who live in the US and vice versa form their own community churches, I was wondering if this experiment or related ones included Korean American or other culturally diverse American churches and vice versa, or were they exclusively American churches or Korean churches?
Right, so in this study, it was exclusively US churches that were in North America and the US, and then it also was Korean websites that were specifically in Korea. So they weren't Korean American or Asian American churches in the US, which are also prevalent, because we wanted to kind of look at it in the cleanest way at first, without the biculturalism issue as much. But I think you raised another point because you mentioned how for our coders, it was our Korean coders who were looking at the Korean websites and the American coders who were looking at the American websites. So one issue is that it's possible that some of the effects are different because of the perceptions of those different coders and not necessarily of the websites themselves. So we have also had our Korean coders who are bilingual Korean English speakers look at a subset of the American websites. And when we did that, the effects were actually even more kind of magnified. So it doesn't seem to be the case that it's because of the coders' perceptions in their different cultures that they see those differences in the websites, although that's also a really interesting question.
If you were to hypothesize, would you say the existing religious beliefs of one community would affect the other culturally diverse churches? Do you think they would be exclusively complicit with their presuppositions, or would you say the other religious beliefs in this society would somehow influence, that they would borrow or take from those religious thoughts?
So are you asking if also different religious values and beliefs can then influence the larger culture? Is that your question?
Or the larger culture, would you think it would influence the smaller culturally diverse churches?
Oh,
if
yes.
you were to look at that subset.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, like every religious community is embedded in this larger context, but the communities will differ in the degree to which they are affected by that broader community. So this is, again, I think relevant to the issue of multiculturalism and biculturalism that you're raising earlier. But some communities do tend to be much more closed, and they have very tight rules about not letting in mainstream culture, and sometimes that has to do with the reasons they're there in the first place, if it's not by choice or by special exceptions. So, or if they went there by choice, a lot of times they are more integrated in the mainstream community. So it depends on their own kind of acceptance to letting in the mainstream culture. There's really interesting work in biculturalism and multiculturalism looking at those different degrees to which people work to maintain their culture, but also let in or don't let in the mainstream culture. So yes, I do think that that would make a difference.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Two quick but interacting questions. One is, can you tell me if you find a country effect in the neutral condition for the sociocultural version of the cheated out of a notebook experiment? Was there in the neutral condition, was there a difference between countries?
Yes. So overall, there is a general difference that the East Asians are not as happy. Yes.
No, there was that interaction. So they were less happy in the neutral condition. I'm
in
not
the
talking
neutral condition.
Okay, they were not.
So if you ignore the religion condition completely, just in the neutral condition when they're writing about just a control condition task, the cultural difference is such that in general, the East Asians were they're looking less happy than the European Americans. And this is consistent with a lot of cultural research, that just there's more kind of acceptance of like positive and negative affect. So in general, they might not appear as positive in affect compared to European Americans, just neutrally, in a neutral condition.
Okay. I wonder that there is a conflation by going across countries. You kept the church affiliation constant, but by going across countries, you are introducing a number of other things that go with culture. So if the key thing is to look at the pro-sociality stance of a particular religious group, why wouldn't you stay, like even within Pennsylvania, you could go and look at Jehovah's Witnesses and Quakers, and you're going to find that the definition in terms of pro-social versus secondary control of the group activities is very, very different, probably as big as you found across countries. So it strikes me, having been in the US and having been in Asia, how different the ways of expressing, difficulties, let's say in a train station. So there's a lot to the language of expression that's different. Why would you introduce an additional variable that is, it sort of contaminates it with the American self-purported focus on independence. I'm not sure that goes beyond the declarative, right? I don't think, well, anyways, that's a different topic. But anyways, what would you expect if you were going to do within the culture with different churches?
Yeah, so actually, in the first study I showed you with the church websites, we do look at different religious groups systematically also, in addition to looking at Korean and American websites. So I don't report that in this talk, but in the paper I talk about how we have Presbyterian and Catholic churches, and we chose them because they are prevalent in both Korea and the United States. And we do find that overall, Catholic churches emphasize more themes of social affiliation than Presbyterian churches. But that was also qualified by an interaction with the broader culture. So that difference in the Catholics and Presbyterians for social affiliation was even bigger in Korea compared to in the United States. So I think absolutely, looking within the culture, you can see religious cultures, for instance, having meaningful differences. But I still see those as embedded within always a larger cultural context, and it's possible that it can further interact with that broader culture. Yeah, I think that's a really important question.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about one thing, a certain phrase that you've been repeating a lot, the larger cultural context, which implies two kinds of things. A, that it's strictly larger than the religion kind of effect, and B, that it's a context as opposed to another kind of thing, although I can't think of in particular what that other kind of thing might be. And I was wondering how committed you are to those two statements about that condition.
Yeah. I think, as I think I mentioned, I might have mentioned earlier, so I do think, in addition to the larger cultural context kind of shaping what are the religious values and beliefs of a community in that context, it does also happen the other way around, that religions, you can find the same religions in different places, and it's possible that that religion might sometimes act as the larger and the broader kind of context that maybe different ethnic or national cultures exist within. I think about that largely because in my work, I think that's the best way to understand these kinds of effects for these specific groups. But I think you're right that it absolutely could be the case. I think especially for certain religions that it's more, they're very good at like maintaining more cohesion, maybe across different countries or ethnicities. And so for them, that is the larger context in which their different ethnic or national values have to operate within. So so I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that
very
it
helpful.
could be that way.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Okay.
So there'll be a 10-minute break so you can get socially sanctioned stimulants.